The German soldiers huddled in their positions outside Odessa in the autumn of 1941, initially greeted news of Soviet female snipers with open mockery and derision. The idea that women, whom Nazi ideology considered fundamentally inferior and unsuited for combat, could pose a serious threat to battle-hardened Wehrmacht troops seemed absurd, even comical. Officers joked about it in their reports. Enlisted men laughed when discussing the notion. The entire concept violated everything German military culture believed about warfare, gender roles, and the natural order of combat. Then the killing began. One by one, German soldiers started falling to perfectly aimed shots that came from nowhere, fired by an enemy they could not see, could not locate, and could not stop. The laughter died in their throats as fear replaced contempt, and nowhere was this transformation more complete than in the sectors where a young Ukrainian woman named Lyudmila Pavlichenko operated. Over the course of her combat service, she would kill 309 German soldiers, becoming the most successful female sniper in history and transforming German attitudes toward Soviet women warriors from mockery to genuine terror. This is the story of how one woman's deadly precision shattered Nazi assumptions, broke German morale, and became a symbol of Soviet resistance that resonated far beyond the battlefields where she fought. To understand the impact of Lyudmila Pavlichenko and the Soviet female snipers, we must first examine the collision of two radically different ideological perspectives on women's roles in warfare and society. Nazi Germany's worldview was built on rigid hierarchies of race and gender, with very specific roles assigned to each category of humanity. In Nazi ideology, women, particularly Aryan women, were to serve as mothers and homemakers, their primary function being to produce and raise children for the Reich. The Nazi slogan for women was Kinderküche, Kirche, meaning children, kitchen, kitchen, church. This was not merely social convention, but state-enforced ideology backed by law and propaganda. German women were systematically excluded from combat roles, and even from most significant positions in war industries until late in the war, when manpower shortages became desperate. The idea of women as warriors, as killers, as equals on the battlefield was not just foreign to Nazi thinking, it was fundamentally incompatible with the entire Nazi worldview. This ideological rigidity created a profound blind spot in German military thinking. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they expected to face an inferior enemy, weakened by Stalinist purges, equipped with obsolete weapons, and led by incompetent officers. The initial successes of Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm these assumptions. German forces advanced with stunning speed, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and driving deep into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, and German soldiers developed a dangerous overconfidence in their own superiority and in the inevitable weakness of their opponents. The Soviet Union, by contrast, operated under a very different ideological framework regarding women and warfare. While Soviet society was hardly egalitarian in practice, and women faced numerous forms of discrimination, official Soviet ideology, at least theoretically, endorsed gender equality and women's participation in all aspects of society, including military service. When the German invasion threatened the very survival of the Soviet state, this ideological foundation allowed the Soviet military to tap into a reservoir of human resources that Germany could not or would not access. Soviet women volunteered for military service in enormous numbers, driven by patriotism. desire for revenge against the invaders, and genuine belief in defending their homeland. While many were assigned to traditional support roles, such as nurses, clerks, and communication specialists, significant numbers served in combat positions including pilots, tank crews, machine gunners, and most famously snipers. The Soviet decision to employ female snipers was not merely ideological but practical. Sniping required qualities that were not dependent on physical strength or size. It demanded patience, attention to detail, steady nerves, excellent eyesight, and the ability to remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions. Soviet military theorists recognized that women could possess these qualities in equal or greater measure than men, and that the psychological impact of female snipers on enemy morale could be significant. Moreover, in the desperate circumstances of 1941 and 1942, when the Soviet Union was fighting for its very existence, every potential source of military strength had to be exploited. If women could kill German invaders effectively, then women would be trained and deployed to do exactly that. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born in 1916 in Bila Tserkva, a city in what is now Ukraine but was then part of the Russian Empire on the verge of revolution and civil war. She grew up in a period of tremendous upheaval, violence, and social transformation. Her early life was marked by the experiences common to her generation of Soviet citizens, including poverty, political turmoil, and the harsh realities of building socialism under Stalin's increasingly totalitarian regime. However, Pavlichenko was not a typical young Soviet woman of her era. She possessed a fierce independence, a competitive spirit, and a determination to prove herself equal to men in any field of endeavor. In her youth, Pavlichenko became interested in shooting, initially as a way to compete with a male friend who had bragged about his marksmanship skills. This seemingly trivial motivation, a desire to prove she was as good as or better than a boastful young man, would eventually lead to her becoming one of the most deadly snipers in military history. She joined a shooting club, which was common in the Soviet Union, where marksmanship was encouraged as both a sport and a form of pre-military training. She proved to have natural talent and quickly developed her skills, eventually becoming an expert marksman. By the time she enrolled at Kiev University to study history, she had already completed sniper training and become a skilled shooter. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Pavlichenko was 24 years old, a university student with a young son, living what could have been an ordinary Soviet civilian life. The invasion changed everything. Like millions of other Soviet citizens, Pavlichenko felt compelled to volunteer for military service to defend her homeland against the Nazi invaders. However, her path to combat was not straightforward. When she appeared at the recruiting office, officials initially tried to steer her toward becoming a nurse, assuming that nursing was the appropriate role for a woman in the military. Pavlichenko refused. She insisted that she was a trained sniper and that she wanted to fight, not provide medical care. To prove her capabilities, she was given a practical test. She was provided with a rifle and directed to demonstrate her shooting skills. She performed flawlessly, convincing skeptical officers that she could indeed serve effectively as a sniper. Pavlichenko was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Chapyev Rifle Division and sent to fight in the defense of Odessa, a major Black Sea port that became one of the key battlegrounds in the early months of the war in southern Ukraine. The siege of Odessa lasted from August to October 1941, and it was here that Pavlichenko would kill her first German soldiers and begin building the reputation that would eventually make her name feared among German troops. The fighting around Odessa was brutal and desperate. Romanian forces, allied with Germany, along with German units, encircled the city and attempted to starve it into submission while launching repeated assaults. Soviet defenders, vastly outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements by land, held out with stubborn determination, supplied only by ships running the gauntlet across the Black Sea. For Pavlichenko, the first kill was the most difficult, not technically, but psychologically. Years later, she would describe the moment when she first had a German soldier in her sights, the internal struggle between her training and the reality of taking a human life, and the final decision to pull the trigger. That first shot was followed by a second, as she engaged two German soldiers who had exposed themselves. After that initial experience, the psychological barrier was broken. She had crossed a threshold that many soldiers, male or female, struggle with, the transition from training to actual killing. From that point forward, Pavlichenko operated with cold efficiency, methodically hunting German soldiers with the patience and precision that would become her trademark. The conditions under which Pavlichenko and other Soviet snipers operated were extraordinarily harsh. Snipers did not fight from comfortable, prepared positions in most cases. They crawled into no man's land, often at night, and concealed themselves in shell craters, ruined buildings, or natural depressions in the ground. They would remain in these positions for hours, sometimes for entire days, barely moving, enduring heat, cold, rain, and the constant danger of artillery fire, air attacks, and enemy patrols. The physical discomfort was immense. Snipers had to control their bodily functions, remaining absolutely still even when experiencing extreme discomfort. They had to maintain focus and concentration despite exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Any movement, any carelessness, could give away their position and result in immediate death from counter-sniper fire or artillery strike. The mental demands were equally severe. A sniper had to possess extraordinary patience, waiting for hours for a target to appear. When a target did present itself, the sniper had only seconds to assess the situation, calculate distance, account for wind and other environmental factors, and take the shot. There was no room for error. A miss would alert the enemy and eliminate the element of surprise. Success required not just marksmanship, but fieldcraft, camouflage skills, an understanding of human psychology to predict enemy behavior, and the ability to think like the enemy. Pavlichenko excelled in all these areas. Her intelligence, her education, and her analytical mindset allowed her to not just shoot accurately, but to hunt effectively, positioning herself where German soldiers would appear and understanding their patterns of behavior well enough to anticipate their movements. The German reaction to Pavlichenko and other Soviet female snipers evolved through distinct stages, reflecting the broader German experience of the Eastern Front, where initial expectations collided brutally with reality. In the early months, when reports first filtered back about female Soviet snipers, the German reaction was overwhelmingly one of mockery and disbelief. German soldiers and officers, steeped in Nazi ideology about gender roles and convinced of their own superiority, simply could not take the threat seriously. Intelligence reports about female snipers were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. When German soldiers were killed by snipers, it was assumed the shooters were male. The idea that women could be killing German soldiers with such efficiency was too threatening to Nazi assumptions about masculinity, military prowess, and racial superiority to be readily accepted. This denial became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulated. Soviet female snipers were occasionally captured or killed, and their bodies or identification papers provided undeniable proof of their existence and their role. Moreover, the killing continued and intensified. German casualties to sniper fire mounted steadily, and increasingly, these casualties were among experienced soldiers, NCOs, and officers who knew how to move in combat zones, and who should have been difficult targets. The precision and patience displayed by Soviet snipers indicated highly trained, disciplined shooters, not the inferior opponents that Nazi propaganda had led German soldiers to expect. As mockery gave way to acknowledgement, a new emotion emerged among German troops. Sniper fire is psychologically devastating in ways that other forms of combat are not. Artillery kills more people, but it kills impersonally and randomly. A soldier caught in an artillery barrage can tell himself that survival is purely a matter of luck, that there is nothing personal in the attack. Machine gun fire is terrifying but unfocused, spraying bullets in all directions. But a sniper selects individual targets, watches them, studies them, and kills them with a single, precisely aimed shot. The victim never sees the shooter. Death comes without warning, a sudden impact and then nothing. For the victim's comrades, the effect is even more psychologically damaging. One moment they are talking with a friend. The next moment that friend is dead. Killed by an enemy they cannot see, cannot locate, and cannot retaliate against. When German soldiers learned that the sniper who had killed their comrades was a woman, the psychological impact was magnified enormously. The psychological impact was magnified enormous. Nazi ideology had taught German soldiers that they were members of a master race, natural warriors, superior to their enemies in every way. The Slavic peoples they were fighting were untermensch, subhumans, inherently inferior. Within this already inferior group, women were doubly inferior, weak and unsuited for combat. For a German soldier to be killed by such a person was not just a death, it was a profound humiliation. A negation of everything Nazi ideology claimed about racial and gender hierarchy. If a Soviet woman could kill experienced German soldiers with ease, what did that say about claims of German superiority? What did it say about Nazi ideology itself? German commanders attempted to counter Soviet snipers through various means. They deployed their own snipers to hunt the Soviet shooters. They increased discipline regarding movement in combat zones, ordering soldiers to avoid exposing themselves unnecessarily. They emphasized the importance of camouflage and cover. In some cases, they specifically targeted known or suspected Soviet sniper positions with artillery or airstrikes. However, none of these measures proved particularly effective against skilled snipers like Pavlichenko, who understood counter-sniper tactics and adapted accordingly. She never used the same position twice if she could avoid it. She varied her patterns, never becoming predictable. She studied German behavior and exploited their mistakes ruthlessly. Pavlichenko's kill count grew steadily during the defense of Odessa. She developed a reputation among her fellow Soviet soldiers as an exceptionally skilled and brave fighter. Her commanders recognized her value and gave her increasing autonomy to operate as she saw fit. By the time Soviet forces evacuated Odessa in mid-October 1941, withdrawing by sea to avoid encirclement, Pavlichenko had killed 187 enemy soldiers, an extraordinary total for less than 3 months of combat. This was not merely impressive marksmanship. Each of those 187 kills represented a separate hunting operation, a separate stalk, a separate moment of perfect execution. It demonstrated not just skill but consistency, discipline, and an almost superhuman ability to function under extreme stress. After the evacuation from Odessa, Pavlichenko was redeployed to Sevastopol, another Black Sea port that would become the site of one of the longest and most brutal sieges of World War II. The siege of Sevastopol lasted from October 1941 until July 1942. 8 months of sustained combat that devastated the city and resulted in enormous casualties on both sides. German forces, frustrated by their inability to quickly capture the city, subjected Sevastopol to relentless bombardment from artillery, aircraft, and even super-heavy siege guns, designed to destroy fortification. Soviet defenders held on with desperate tenacity, knowing that every day they held tied down German forces that could otherwise be used elsewhere. In Sevastopol, Pavlichenko continued her deadly work. The urban environment, with its ruined buildings and complex terrain, provided both opportunities and challenges for sniper operations. The extensive destruction created numerous hiding places and firing positions, but it also made movement dangerous and complicated. German forces, having learned painful lessons about Soviet snipers, were more cautious and disciplined in their movements. However, they could not eliminate all vulnerability. Soldiers still had to move, officers still had to direct operations, and observation posts still had to be manned. Pavlichenko exploited every opportunity, adding to her kill count with patient, methodical efficiency. During her time in Sevastopol, Pavlichenko engaged in what she later described as some of her most challenging operations, including several duels with German snipers. Counter-sniper operations are among the most demanding and dangerous aspects of sniper work. Both sides are trained in concealment, patient, and skilled marksmen. The contest becomes a battle of wills, nerves, and tactical thinking, with death as the price of any mistake. Pavlichenko described one duel that lasted for days, with both she and her German counterpart carefully maneuvering, setting up false positions, using decoys, and trying to force the other to make a mistake. Eventually, Pavlichenko prevailed, identifying her opponent's true position and killing him with a single shot. Such duels added to her reputation, and to the fear that German soldiers were developing towards Soviet female snipers in general, and Pavlichenko in particular. By the time Pavlichenko was evacuated from Sevastopol in June 1942, wounded by mortar fire, her confirmed kill count had reached 309. This total included 36 enemy snipers, a particularly significant statistic given the difficulty and danger of counter-sniper operations. 309 confirmed kills meant 309 separate engagements where she had stalked, located, and killed an enemy soldier. It meant hundreds of hours spent in uncomfortable, dangerous positions. It meant thousands of rounds fired in training to maintain her skills. It meant an extraordinary level of psychological resilience, the ability to kill repeatedly without succumbing to what we would now call post-traumatic stress, though such concepts were not well understood at the time. The Soviet military and propaganda apparatus recognized the value of Pavlichenko's achievements, both militarily and symbolically. Here was a young woman who embodied Soviet ideals of gender equality, who had proven herself equal or superior to men in combat, and who had killed hundreds of Nazi invaders. She was exactly the kind of hero that Soviet propaganda needed to boost morale at home, and to demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union was resisting the German invasion with every resource at its disposal. Pavlichenko was withdrawn from combat, much to her frustration as she wanted to continue fighting. and sent on a propaganda tour to boost morale and encourage support for the Soviet war effort. This propaganda tour took Pavlichenko to the United States and Canada, where she became an international celebrity and a symbol of Soviet resistance. She met with President Franklin Roosevelt, addressed packed audiences, and was featured in numerous newspaper articles and newsreels. American audiences were fascinated and somewhat scandalized by this young woman who spoke matter-of-factly about killing hundreds of Hydley men. American journalists, operating within their own cultural assumptions about gender roles, often asked her frivolous questions about makeup and fashion, questions that Pavlichenko answered with barely concealed contempt. She gave speeches emphasizing the seriousness of the war and the sacrifices Soviet people were making, often pointedly noting that she had killed more enemy soldiers than many of the men in her audiences had even seen. The American and Canadian tour served multiple purposes beyond simple propaganda. It helped build support for opening a second front in Western Europe, something the Soviet Union desperately wanted to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. It demonstrated to Western audiences that the Soviet Union was a serious military power fighting effectively against Nazi Germany, and it provided evidence that women could serve effectively in combat roles, a notion that was even more controversial in the United States and Britain than it was in the Soviet Union. Pavlichenko became a symbol of female empowerment, though she would likely have rejected such characterization, preferring to see herself simply as a Soviet patriot defending her homeland. After her propaganda tour, Pavlichenko worked as a sniper instructor, training the next generation of Soviet snipers who would carry on the work she had begun. Her combat experience and her analytical intelligence made her an exceptional teacher. She understood not just how to shoot but how to survive, how to think, and how to maintain psychological balance under extreme stress. The snipers she trained would go on to kill thousands more German soldiers, multiplying her impact far beyond her personal kill count. In a very real sense, every German soldier killed by a sniper Pavlichenko trained could be partially credited to her expertise and her willingness to share her knowledge. The German military never fully developed an effective counter to Soviet female snipers. The ideological blind spot that had led to initial mockery persisted throughout the war, preventing German commanders from fully appreciating and adapting to this threat. German soldiers learned to fear Soviet snipers, but this fear did not translate into effective tactical solutions. The fundamental problem was that snipers, whether male or female, were difficult to counter with the means available to World War II-era militaries. They operated independently or in small teams. They were highly mobile. They could attack from any direction, and they disappeared after attacking, making retaliation nearly impossible. The only truly effective counter to snipers was more snipers, and the Germans never developed a sniper program comparable in scale or effectiveness to what the Soviets achieved. The transformation of German attitudes from mockery to fear regarding Soviet female snipers reflects broader patterns in the German experience on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union, expecting a quick victory over an inferior enemy. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance, harsh conditions, enormous distances, and an enemy who adapted and improved while German advantages eroded. The initial German success, which had seemed to validate all their assumptions about superiority, gave way to grinding attrition, mounting casualties, and the slow realization that they were locked in a war they might not win. Soviet female snipers, and Pavlichenko in particular, symbolized this reversal. What had seemed laughable became deadly. What Nazi ideology declared impossible proved devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of Pavlichenko and her fellow female snipers extended beyond their direct kills. Every German soldier who heard stories about the female snipers, every unit that lost men to their fire, absorbed the lesson that the enemy was more capable and more determined than Nazi propaganda had claimed. This erosion of confidence, this gradual recognition that Nazi ideology's claims about racial and gender superiority were false, contributed to declining German morale as the war progressed. Soldiers who had invaded the Soviet Union believing they were Superman, fighting subhumans, eventually found themselves desperately defending against an enemy who had proven equal or superior in numerous ways. The story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko also reveals important truths about warfare, gender, and capability. For centuries, women had been systematically excluded from combat roles based on assumptions about their physical weakness, emotional unsuitability, and natural incapacity for violence. Pavlichenko demonstrated conclusively that these assumptions were false, at least for certain types of combat. Sniping did not require superior physical strength. It required skills and attributes that had nothing to do with gender. Patience, precision, intelligence, and the ability to control one's emotions under stress. Pavlichenko possessed all these qualities in abundance, and she proved that a woman could kill as effectively as any man when given the training, equipment, and opportunity. However, it would be a mistake to romanticize Pavlichenko's experience, or to minimize the genuine psychological toll that her service must have exacted. Killing 309 people, even enemy combatants who were part of an army of invasion and genocide, is not something that any psychologically healthy person does without effect. Pavlichenko spoke little about the psychological impact of her service in her later life, maintaining the stoic facade expected of Soviet war heroes. But glimpses in her occasional interviews suggest a woman who had been profoundly marked by her experiences, who had nightmares, who carried memories of the men she had killed, and who struggled with the weight of what she had done, even as she maintained that it had been necessary and justified. After the war, Pavlichenko completed her university education, earning a degree in history, and worked in various administrative positions within the Soviet military establishment. She never returned to combat, though she remained active in veterans organizations and continued to speak about her wartime experiences when called upon. She married and divorced twice, struggled with health problems related to her wartime injuries, and dealt with the challenges of living as a celebrity in a society that was both proud of its war heroes and deeply traumatized by the enormous losses of the war. She died in 1974 at the age of 58, her health undermined by wounds and stress from her wartime service. The legacy of Lyudmila Pavlichenko extends far beyond her personal kill count or her wartime fame. She demonstrated that women could serve effectively in combat roles, challenging assumptions that persisted in most militaries for decades after World War II. She became a symbol of Soviet resistance and female empowerment, though the extent to which Soviet society actually embraced gender equality remained debatable. She forced German soldiers to confront the falseness of Nazi ideology's claims about racial and gender hierarchy, contributing to the psychological erosion of German military effectiveness. And she saved countless Soviet lives by killing enemy soldiers who would otherwise have killed her comrades. The transformation of German attitudes from mockery to fear regarding Pavlichenko and Soviet female snipers reveals how ideology can create dangerous blind spots in military thinking. The Germans' inability to take the threat seriously until it had already cost them dearly demonstrates the danger of allowing prejudice and preconception to override evidence and experience. Had German commanders recognized earlier that Soviet women could be effective snipers, they might have developed better countermeasures and reduced their casualties. Instead, they allowed ideological assumptions about gender to blind them to reality until that reality had already inflicted significant damage. In the final analysis, the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko is about more than just sniping or gender equality or Soviet propaganda. It is about the collision between ideology and reality, about how assumptions shaped by prejudice can prove catastrophically wrong when tested in the crucible of war, and about how individuals can transcend the limitations that society attempts to impose on them through determination, skill, and courage. The German soldiers who laughed at the idea of Soviet female snipers learned to fear them through bitter experience, and none taught that lesson more effectively than the young Ukrainian woman who killed 309 of them and lived to tell the tale. Her rifle fell silent in 1942, but the echo of those 309 shots, each one precisely aimed, each one ending a life, each one striking a blow against an ideology built on hatred and false superiority, resonates through history as a testament to what one person, given the opportunity and the will, can achieve even in the darkest of times.